Hi everyone, this is our second queer conversation for Muncie Pride 2020, and this is our generational lesbian conversation.
My name is Rose, I'm 18, my pronouns are she, her. When I came out 2 times because when I first figured out I liked girls, I just assumed I liked everybody, so I thought I was pansexual. But then finally, after a few years of, I figured out I was a lesbian, and I was, I think, 16. Coming out was a positive experience for me because luckily my family and friends are all very supportive of the LGBT community. I had relatives who were in it, so I had a lot of support, so it was really good. For me, the process was less about coming out and more just about figuring out that I was a lesbian. But it was a positive experience for me.
I'm Amber. I am 29. My pronouns are she, her. And I, kind of like Rose, I came out twice, but once was more socially. So when I was away for college, came out when I was about 19. And that was to all my peers, my roommates. I started dating women at that time, but I didn't actually come out to my family or my parents until I was about 23. And it was very positive for me. My parents actually thought that something was wrong because I called them crying. And then when I told them that I was a lesbian, my mom was almost relieved. She told me that they already knew and that they were just happy that I finally figured things out for myself.
My name is Melanie. I use she, her pronouns. I am 39. I came out when I was in my mid-20s, would have been about 2007. It was not the greatest experience, and I should say that was more of a beginning of coming out. I somewhat came out at that time, but I did not have a lot of support at that time. I had just dropped out of seminary. I had very much a religious background to most of the community I was in, including the university I'd attended. And I found that a lot of friends didn't really know what to do with me at that point. And so, unfortunately, I kind of stopped my coming out process midway. And there probably would have been more support if I had come out to more people, but I was honestly afraid to after a few bad experiences. So, some of my family, a few in my family were accepting, a lot weren't. So it was a tough time. I didn't have a lot of support.
My name's Kim, she, her, hers, and I am 56, and I came out in my freshman year of college in around 1983. Never looked back.
My name is Flo. I'm 85 years old, and I came out to myself, really. That was the big thing. It was in 1958. I think I was 22, and I was horrified. I was horrified and just frightened because I had been groomed from childhood to grow up and marry a good Jewish man. So the idea that I was queer was just a confounding. Not that I wasn't suspecting it for a long time. I fell in love with my first girlfriend when I first went to Northwestern University, and but I still tried. I told 2 psychiatrists that I thought I was a lesbian, and they told me that I was just fantasizing. And I don't know why a young woman would fantasize about being queer in a homophobic society. Anyway, I was so terrified that I ran away from my family and from America because I figured everybody would totally reject me, and it would be horrible, and I would probably be alone for the rest of my life. As it turned out, I actually had a partner for 4 to 6 years until she died. So I ran away to Paris. I figured I would always go to Paris anyway, and so that's what I did. Came out to myself, ran away, and ended up in Paris, France.
I was in college, and I remember I had a girl in one of my classes that I knew was a lesbian. And I kind of had spoken with her, and she told me about our queer resource center that they had at Purdue. And so I would go down there, and it was just individuals doing their homework and kind of hanging out. And so that was nice, just to be around other people. And then I actually, too, I went to the Mark tap room when I had first came out and came home for the holidays. And I didn't even drink. I think I got a Sprite. But it was just nice being around individuals who were older than me, especially, and having just that like kind of natural support. There's still a couple people that I'll see in the community now, and it's a nice reminder of kind of the support they gave me, not even knowing that they were supporting a newly, person who had just kind of entered into that community.
I went away to college to come out intentionally, but I went to a very tiny college in Maine, in the woods in Maine. It only has 300 students. So to come out was quite a big thing, but luckily, you've got 300 students. There's going to be a certain number of queer people, and we all found each other right away. And so just a super tight family, from the get-go, of both men and women, and that just set me up for knowing like this is who I am and who I want to be, is that full support of a tight family.
This is amazing. I mean, and what support did I have? Zero. I mean, there was no support, and if there was, I was not able to perceive it, because the whole idea of being a queer was just I thought was unsupportable by myself. But I eventually made it. No support. None. When I did come out to my parents some years later, my mother said she said she would be much happier if I were a prostitute. But she mellowed eventually.
I didn't really have a lot of support when I came out. Probably from 2007 until 2015 was probably the first time that I felt like I had some solid support. And after coming out, basically the first person who showed any interest in me, I was so afraid of being alone, I got into an abusive relationship. And the little bit of support that I might have had, that the dynamics of that relationship kind of counteracted. So it wasn't until I finally broke free of that, and it was the Mark III tap room, walking into there, which I'd only ever been in like maybe 2 bars before that. I mean, I'd had 4 alcoholic drinks ever before walking in there. I didn't even know how to order a drink, but it was the local gay bar that really kind of saved my life. And was the building point of finding support for myself within the queer community.
Coming out, I had a lot of support because luckily, my family was very supportive, especially my mom. She's an angel. I love her so much. But then I also had a lot of extra support because it changed names and like sponsors throughout the years, but we've always had a GSA at Central the time I've been there, and I've been like involved in that both as a participant and as a leader in that group. So I've been able to get support from teachers who are helpful in case you have an issue or want to talk, and from fellow students. And along with that, I was lucky enough to be able to be at Muncie Outreach. And like I knew it was there for a while, but then I like finally started going either my sophomore or junior year of high school. I started going after hearing about it so much. And there I was able to find, not just other LGBT people who would support me and I'd be able to be open with, but I also found other lesbians.
Looking back on my life and thinking of, maybe things that I had done or feelings that I had when I was younger, if I would have known maybe what those feelings meant, I would have came out at a younger age. Maybe I would have came out when I was in high school or something like that. But I think our youth now are seeing more LGBT individuals and knowing, what they're feeling or what they're thinking, what that means and what that has to do with, their life and how things can improve if they're starting to be honest with themselves and others about those feelings.
I'm absolutely amazed. My partner and I were we just couldn't believe, we never thought it would happen that gay people could marry one another. I mean, that was just unthinkable, because we both lived in the closet, well, all our adult lives, practically. Well, yes, until I retired. And then I just said, up yours. No one's putting bread on my table anymore. I can be out. But not until then, even with the greater openness. For one, I was both as a teacher, and a high school teacher, and as a professor. I couldn't come out.
I grew up in Muncie and moved away because I wanted to come out, and I moved as far as I could. But 6 years ago, my parents are getting older, and so I came back to Muncie. Just to say that when I first came back, I learned about Muncie Outreach. It's the LGBT youth group here in Muncie. And I said, if I come back here, I've got to be involved in some way to be able to help kids come out, because that's all I needed. Just some support, just a little push, and I would have come out earlier too. So definitely, people are coming out earlier now.
And you have been helping a lot.
Well, I hope.
Other people.
So many people do, though. It's amazing.
I think that if there was more acceptance when I was younger, and in the community that I was in, 'cause that geographically makes a big difference. I grew up in northern Indiana in Middlebury, and it would have made all the difference in the world if I had had just one openly queer person in my life who I actually knew, who wasn't Ellen DeGeneres, who wasn't Katie Lang, and I feel fortunate that I had those two that I could see on TV, because that's not nothing, but to have one openly queer person when I was a young person who could have said to me, it's absolutely okay, you will survive this, it would have completely changed the trajectory of my life. So I think that has to have an impact on today's youth.
I think activism just looks different now. I think the way that we're approaching it is different. It's not a sense of maybe fighting like we were before for maybe equal rights, but just that kind of people seeing us and, remembering that we receive these equal rights and we need to continue to receive the equal rights. But it's different, when we go from back in the 70s, to now and how far we've come. Obviously things are going to change, and I think activism has changed with the times, with social media and technology and the amount of individuals that people know who are LGBT. That just all impacts how we handle it.
I don't even think it's necessarily just activism itself, but the visibility of that activism and how it's portrayed in the media, because there has been activism for decades and decades and decades, even within my lifetime, but I had little awareness of that as a youth and as a young adult even. Because the media did not show that, and when it did, it portrayed it in such a negative manner that it was hard to see the activism for what it really was. So I do think, though, that with the legalization of with marriage equality, that for some people there is a bit of complacency now that we've achieved this, not understanding that can still be taken away, and not understanding that's just one part of our rights. And in some ways that may not even be the most important part of our rights, that our community is impacted by laws and attitudes in so many other ways that still need to be dealt with.
I think activism has really changed. I don't think it's lessened or gotten more strong, because I was an activist from the get-go. I was in the streets protesting and doing all kinds of things. But it's this evolution of our awareness of intersectionalities and knowing, just being, let's just say LGB, and I'll stop there and not even say T, just being that. That used to be kind of what we were more, having to push for our rights. Now that that's had acceptance, okay, now we understand, T, that's a really important part. So we're going to, really push for rights there. Now we're getting a better understanding of race and seeing, that the experience of white LGBT people is very different from the experience of black LGBT people. So I think it's just evolved.
I would agree.
I think in some ways we do a very poor job being here in the United States, having solidarity with the queer community globally. I feel like we, in order to do that, we have to be so intentional about seeking out the information about what's going on in Chechnya, about what's going on in all sorts of other countries on other continents, to know that there has to be more we can do, and I don't know what to do to help that. There's the Rainbow Railroad, there are organizations out there that are trying to make a difference globally, but sometimes we are too focused, I think, on our own here, and we lack that perspective of being aware that, we've reached a decent place here where we can live somewhat okay. That is not the case for our brothers and sisters and siblings all over the globe.
Well, I think, kind of like I said earlier, showing, young individuals that they can come out and that there are people who have the same thoughts as them or the same feelings as them, especially I think the media. I mean, nowadays, I think for young kids, YouTube people and influencers and people like that are so important in their lives. Seeing that there are people who are successful and people who, live their lives as adults helps show them, that they can do it too. And having that visibility at a young age.
LGBT people are part of reality just as much as any straight person is. Like, a lot of times when you see LGBT people being discussed with education, it's about history. Whether people like to admit it or not, we're a part of history just like everyone else is. And we shouldn't ignore that because, we're making history today.
I think that what you were saying earlier about coming out, when you came out, you were isolated and you hung on to those two celebrities you knew, but you didn't know any queer people. So, you were saved by those celebrities.
Well, I think for me, there were queer people in my community, but they weren't out. Right. They weren't out. And there were a couple in my community who I even knew, and the community suspected that they were queer and treated them terribly. Treated them just terribly. But these were people that I loved so dearly and I looked up to so dearly, especially as a kid. I admired them so much. And I didn't have any support as a kid, but I had that I could look at those people and say, even if the rumors about them are true, I would love them every bit as much as I do right now. It wouldn't change it for me. And so I always had that to come back to, that if I still would love them, regardless of whether or not they were gay, what does that say about me as a gay person? And even now, I still go back to that and have to remind myself of that. So representation, be it in the media or people within your reach in person, is extremely important.
Well, the discussion brings to mind a memory I have while teaching in high school, and that was this young man who was harassed horribly. He was obviously gay to everybody, and he didn't hide it. The male teachers were absolutely horrible. And at one point, I don't know what the male teacher was mad at him for, but he whirled him around and threw him in the hallway and threw him against the wall. It just so happened that, and my ability to reach out to kids that I knew were gay was highly limited. It just so happened that my partner and I were in a larger city, Grand Rapids, to see a folk singer, and I don't remember who, but he was there. And so we talked with each other. He had been in my class, and I said, well, how are you going home? He said, oh, I'll just hitch a ride. I said, well, we'll take you home. So that was obviously one way. I mean, then he met, of course, my partner, and then he knew, and it was I felt very good about that. Incidentally, he left the school, and then a couple of years later, a letter came to the teachers' lounge, and it was posted there, and the teachers were reading it, and he said something to the effect, "I know you're going to be very, very surprised, many of you, but I graduated from such and such in high school with honors." And I thought, yes. And I said so. I said, good for, I forget his name, good for Mark. And that was about as out as I was in the teacher's lounge, just praising him. But that was just a memory. And I'm thinking, if this were happening now, well, it wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't have happened that male teachers could just be consumed with this one young man who was obviously gay.
Looking at bar communities, for example, they are very male oriented, and that can be very frustrating. Like, I would not go to a gay bar trying to find someone to go on a date with because there are just not many women there. So things are definitely, men are catered to in those settings a lot of the time. And we see that just in the disappearance of lesbian bars. They're a thing of the past. There are very few in the country still. So I think, though, also in working in groups that are predominantly queer, I still think there is some sexism in regards to men's voices are still taken more seriously in a lot of ways than women's voices. And that can be really frustrating because in some ways, you know, I feel like, oh, I'm in a queer group and, you know, people will listen to me, people will take my ideas as valuable, and that just doesn't always happen. The flip side of that, though, is I do think it's important to remember that there are some ways in which our communities have been treated differently. One, the AIDS epidemic obviously did not affect the lesbian community in the same way that it did with men and with trans folks. And the other part of that is that I think when it comes to violence, people facing violence, I still feel like maybe in some ways men are targeted more for that than women. And I think that's an important thing for us to kind of keep in mind. Not that there's never violence against lesbians, but men are still at risk of violence in the world today, in the United States.
I'm not speaking from personal experience, but masculine presenting women, I think, masculine presenting lesbians have, to me, you were talking about earlier about violence against gay men, but I think masculine presenting women really have a lot of violence directed at them.
I remember when we didn't have technology, and I remember, you know, the pre-internet days, and, you know, obviously I wasn't out then, you know, I was still really young, but I know when I first came out, even things like, you know, I didn't have an iPhone, you know, and so I had an iPod, but I didn't have an iPhone, and so dating websites and things like that were still very taboo. You know, the fact that someone would be on a dating website, it was almost like, oh wow, like what are you doing? You know, there's predators and things. But now, I mean, the majority of your friends and people, at least in my generation, that's how they meet. You know, and meeting someone who's halfway across the country, halfway across the world is almost like a norm now. Whereas before, and you know, in the older generations, that wasn't really a thing. You know, I was lucky enough, I met my girlfriend of 4 years in Muncie, you know, oddly enough, but I did spend my fair time, you know, on dating websites and meeting girls that I had to drive 6 hours to go see, and, you know, things like that. But I think, you know, it's made a large impact on kind of the negative too of bullying. You know, there may not be as much violence, actual physical violence, but the ability to bully people is so much more prevalent now because someone can see someone's Facebook post, you know, even if they don't know them, they can still use their words, you know, as violence against people that they may not even know a single thing about, but they may not like their picture or the way they dress or the comment they made or something like that. So I think it's helped, but it's also hindered us definitely in moving forward.
I think it's important to see the strengths in our community, like the queer community, but also the lesbian community. And something that's been powerful for me was learning about the way the lesbian community stepped up during the AIDS epidemic, for example. Realizing that there was a role that a lot of lesbians played in helping with that. When the straight community stepped back, the lesbian community stepped up. And I think that part of what we can do as a community going forward to battle that internalized homophobia is to continue in our activism. And that does mean being active in advocating for trans rights. And hoping to dispel some of those stereotypes, which sometimes in some situations are deserved. But if we want to be proud of who we are individually and as a community, we just need to continue in the path that those before us went in fighting for our own rights and those for others who are marginalized.